Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to From Within She Rises. I'm going to go into this with a very good attitude today because I'm having to record this again. My internet went out. So let's pray to God right now, all of us together, that this is going to work. Today's episode is one that I planned but didn't quite plan the cohesion of it, if you will, but it's one that made itself impossible to ignore. Because sometimes awakening doesn't just arrive as love and light, it usually arrives in clarity. It usually arrives in clarity in choosing to not stay in a polarized situation any longer. And clarity, that kind of clarity does not argue. Today we are going to talk about the goddess Sekhmet, the lioness, the fire, the truth force, and why real spiritual awakening is not just about choosing only the light. It's about willing to see what you've been avoiding without needing to fight it. This episode is about spiritual sovereignty and shadow, and why love without truth becomes self-erasure, and why the deepest power isn't in convincing anyone, but it's in withdrawing consent from what no longer aligns. So as you know, before we get started here, we're going to drop into the body together. I'm ready to close your eyes if it feels good to do so. Wherever you are, just gently bring your awareness inward. Feel your feet on the ground. Feel the weight of your body up against the chair, or maybe the bed, the floor. Taking a slow, deep breath in through the nose, and a soft, long exhale through the mouth. Feeling your shoulders soften, your jaw unclench. I just want you to notice here in this stillness if there's any part of you that's been holding tension, that's been maybe waiting to defend your perception, your truth, that's been waiting to explain or just to be understood. And just for this moment, we're going to let that go. You don't need to prove anything here. You are safe to listen from your own knowing. And I invite you to open your eyes and come back into the room you're in. And today we are talking about Sekhmet. And Sekhmet is an ancient Egyptian goddess. Her name is actually, it means the powerful one. And she is depicted in the Egyptian culture as a lioness, not because she's cruel, but because she is precise. So Sekhmet is actually associated with, she is a paradox in and of herself. She is associated with plague and purification and divine wrath, and also with healing. And that paradox really does matter. You think about like the book of Revelation. I know that always comes back to me. Oh my gosh, it's 144 as I say this. Anyways, you think about the book of Revelation, and there's depictions in there of fire, and we think it's bad, but it's actually good. It's a purification method. It's the erasing of the illusions that we have built, the masks that we wear. It's pulling all of those down. And at the end, the paradox being that there's beauty, that we're, whether you see it as a literal heaven on earth, or whether you see it as your new identity, the one that doesn't have to put masks on anymore, emerging. And I do think like the enlightenment, the awakening, whatever process, the healing process, whatever you're calling it, I think it truly is like you're constantly reinventing yourself. You're constantly removing one mask or 3 masks or 10 masks at a time sometimes, and like rising out of that fire, out of that phoenix energy as a new version of yourself. So let's get back to Sekhmet. Sekhmet is not destruction for destruction's sake. It's just like Kali, who was not that. She is an immune response of the divine. So in the myth itself, humanity is falling out of alignment with Mat, and it's falling out of alignment with cosmic order, with truth and balance. And Sekhmet comes in, and she's sent not to punish, but to correct us back onto our path of alignment. And she does not negotiate with the illusion. She's not like, oh, you can keep that mask. Let's take this one off, but we can keep that one on sometimes. Maybe on Fridays you can put that mask on. She simply reveals the consequences of being out of truth until the illusion can no longer survive. I think she's like the discomfort that comes in over and over and over in our lives until we're like, I don't want to feel this way anymore. This mask needs to come off. And the part that people tend to forget is that Sekhmet does not remain forever in this myth. When her work is complete, she transforms into Hathor. And that is joy, it's pleasure, it's restoration, it's life. It's again going back to the book of Revelation where we see the fire purifying ourselves of these masks that we've been wearing, of the illusion. And then at the end, there's beauty. So it's fire first and then softness. And that is the cycle that we see. I always see the book of Revelation as something that is cyclical, that it's spiral. I love my spirals. So somewhere along the way, spirituality became confused with politeness. I think like spirituality being, if we're defining it as healing modalities, if we're defining it as like, I think healing, spirituality, awakening, enlightenment, it's all the same thing. It's just in different perceptions and verbiage. And, I think we really got confused with the politeness. I've talked about this time and time again. I see every trigger as an opportunity for me to be like, why am I triggered? How do I heal? And when you start to like allow yourself so beautifully to show up and connect with those pieces of you that don't want to be seen, it really is like you just like spiral deeper and faster, and like those masks are being ripped off one after another, because every time you meet that shadow, every time you meet the trigger, every time you pause instead of react, it's you at least starting to peel a mask off, if not ripping it off completely, when you actually see what's underneath. And I'm not saying dissociate. I'm saying you need to sit there and with yourself and be like, okay, why do I feel this way? When's the first time I felt this way? And I think I've said this before, I say a lot of controversial things. You know this about me. But I've talked about the triggers being something that's avoidant in the healing space, where we're like, okay, trauma informed healing is just avoiding the trigger whatsoever. This person doesn't like this, we're just going to avoid it. But I think it's less of like avoidance, because then that also makes us afraid as spiritual leaders that are healing ourselves and really have found the keys for ourselves and want to share those keys. It makes us afraid to open our mouths. Like, what truths can we share? What truths can we not? If we instead also at the same time are giving the world, the collective resources to understand that actually every trigger is a blessing. And if you meet it that way, it's actually really beautiful. I think we get a lot farther. But the fact of the matter is that somewhere along the way we have been taught to be polite, and I always talk about Bambi. You remember Bambi? Bambi. And that Thumper's mom always said that if you don't have anything nice to say, then don't say anything at all. And that always really resonated with me. But I think it's not that you can't say anything at all. It's just, if it's not nice, what you're saying, quote unquote nice, is it coming from a healed space, or is it coming from a shadow? And that's for you to be digging deep and seeing what that's coming from. And can you meet this person that you're saying something rudely to with compassion? And so there's some bearing to, if you have nothing nice to say, don't say anything at all. But there's a fine line of where you still want to be able to speak your truth if you can be speaking it from a healed lens and not a shadow. But we have really learned that being loving means never making anyone uncomfortable. It means really avoiding other people's triggers, knowing their triggers and tippy-toeing around them. That compassion meant to be silent, that peace meant to swallow truth. I think the best thing I was ever given from a friend of mine when I was in not great relationship, but I was co-creating it, to be fair, regardless of whether I would be considered the victim or not. I think the kindest thing that I had at that time was a friend who would listen and give her opinion, but not from a, oh my God, you have to do it this way, but just from a, okay, let's like mirror this back to you and let you come to your own conclusions. And that was truly the nicest thing I've ever been given. And we've also been taught that peace meant swallowing your truth. And again, I come back to, are you speaking from a healed wound or the shadow? because I think that we really do have to be standing up and speaking our truth. And, not to say that there are things that I've said, where like, I always go back to the idea that when I first realized that, in the Gnostic texts, like the Secret Book of John and Nature of the Rulers, there's this like demiurge. And I was like, oh my gosh, like that was like me. My wound was like, I need something outside of myself that's the problem, that's not me. And so when I read these texts, and this might sound controversial because maybe you're not there yet, but when I read these texts and I was like, oh my gosh, there's actually like an evil God that we're like praising. And then like the Christians don't even understand. They don't even realize that they're praising this evil God. Like that was me. I even spoke the truth. I even do speak the truth sometimes, because I also realize that needs to be a step that a lot of people need to go down. If anything, I've realized that there are a lot of spirals that I've gone down that I needed to go down the edge of the spiral before I was ready to go down the middle. And I spoke that truth from that healed version of myself, only to heal deeper and realize that God cannot change. It's only our human perception that changes what we think God is. And so if God is love, then God is love everywhere. It's just dependent on, do you think he's love? Because if you don't think he's love, you're calling in a God that will judge you, that will hurt you, that will scold you, that will bring in karmic consequences, instead of a God that is all loving. And yeah, anyways, like that was a big aha for me. But I also realized that I needed to speak the truth of like that first spiral of healing, to come in deeper to the middle of it. So when we think that peace is actually just swallowing our truth and not saying anything, that's also not good, because a lot of people need your little trigger. Maybe it's the trigger of that understanding to start to question themselves. And they may not come to the same conclusions as you, and that's absolutely fine. But maybe they need to hear your version of truth to come to theirs. And I want you to understand this, because love without truth is not enlightenment. It's avoidance. And light without shadow doesn't heal us. It blinds us. We need both. One of the clearest signs that someone is not yet sovereign is the need to argue. And I set a rule very early on in my spiritual journey that I had like a 2 and done rule at first, where if somebody asked me a question in the comments, I'll answer twice, but I'm not going to go any further. It quickly turned into a 1 and done rule. And I honestly very rarely comment to comments that disagree with me anymore. And it's not like I'm like, oh, I'm the best. It's just that as soon as I step into whatever I'm perceiving your connotation to be, I'm like telling you, okay, you're arguing with me, let me meet you there. And I've had very few situations where, especially in comments, maybe if I sat down and I talked to somebody, it would be very different, because I always want to bridge that gap. But I've had very few where I've been able to bridge the gap. And so the 2 and done and then the 1 and done rule were really good for me, because I can explain something deeper once. And if you're not willing to meet me there, then we're just going to keep fighting with our egos and with nothing else. And that moment that you really need to be right, you've already handed your authority away. Real awakening is the moment that you realize that spirit doesn't debate. God doesn't need you to stick up for him, her, whatever you're saying. Source, creator does not need you to be stepping in. If you believe that source, creator, God, universe is all powerful, why would they need you to step in for them? That's just your ego talking, or your shadow, or whatever we're saying. Spirit reveals and then it steps back, right? And that's honestly, like, I think it really started with me being the woman that when a video triggers me, a reel triggers me, a TikTok triggers me, I stop being the person that allowed that trigger to go into my body and make me angry. I just sat with it and I was like, okay, how can I see that from their perspective and also my perspective, and how are like both of them kind of right at the same time? And that's truly the paradox you kind of have to live in, is that there are no absolute truths. And how does that person see that as their truth and I see mine as my truth? And how can we kind of bridge the gap? But the reality of it is I've come to really realize that I'm not going to be the one bridging the gaps in the comments. And the moment I started not doing that, I truly called in less of it into my energy as well, right? Because you're putting out what you want to receive. Think about that. Just going to leave that one there. And let's get back to Sekhmet, because she's not rage. She is refusal. And she's that refusal to negotiate reality. She's the refusal to perform accessibility. She's the refusal to dilute truth for harmony. Her energy really looks like naming the pattern once and saying, peace, you got it, there you go, enjoy, And they say that in the Bible. I forget what the scripture is, but I think it's in Matthew. Oh, I wish I knew it offhand. I'm not very good at knowing things by heart, because to me, it doesn't matter what's someone else's exact truth. I might resonate with pieces of it, but anyways, the scripture itself goes along the lines of when somebody doesn't agree with you, you're meant to just walk away. So that's what Sekhmet does. That's that energy. She names the pattern and then she walks away. She doesn't need to argue. It's about not needing to repeat yourself, not needing to defend your perception, because your truth is your truth, and you don't need to convince anyone, and you don't need to try and escalate the situation, because that's always going to come from ego. I think the reality of getting to a point in an awakening, a healing, or whatever, where you realize that there is never going to be an absolute truth. There's going to be your truth. There's going to be someone else's truth, and there's a merging in the middle where you can meet always. But when you realize that there's no absolute truth, it really makes you reflect on the fact that there was literally never any point to get upset over someone else's truth. It shouldn't be threatening to you, and your truth shouldn't be threatening to them. And it really puts a kibosh on you can name the pattern and walk away kind of thing, and having to argue about it instead. So yeah. It's truly, her energy is seeing something with clarity, seeing it clearly, and simply not consenting to what's out of alignment. And that's what spiritual sovereignty looks like in real life. That's what it is. It's not control. It's not domination. It's choice. You choose what enters your nervous system. You choose which story lands. You choose which projections stick in your life. And when you stop consenting internally, you don't need to reject externally. That's the fire that ends the argument. I've really realized, like, the energetic sovereignty, the energetic spiritual sovereignty is it. It's realizing that, like, as soon as somebody says something that triggers you and you're like, I'm not going to accept that. I'm not going to accept this version of you that I'm perceiving. And I'm not going to accept the version of me that you're trying to pull forth. And I'm going to stay in center. I'm going to stay in alignment. Let's dive a little bit deeper into the transformation of what Sekhmet provides, because Sekhmet doesn't stay because she doesn't need to. That's a really important part that gets neglected. Once truth is embodied, force becomes unnecessary. And this is where people think that fire disappears, but it doesn't. It just integrates, right? It's not that we're dissociating from the angry parts of us. We're just being like, okay, my truth is amazing. Their truth is amazing to them, and nothing is threatening here. How do I integrate the fire? How do I see what you're trying to pull out in me, but I don't consent to that. Maybe somebody, I recently was brought to my awareness that somebody really puts me on a pedestal that I don't consent to. I have been consenting to it without even realizing it, because it was a shadow, right? I thought, okay, yeah, I get it. You don't want to meet me here, so I can be on this little pedestal, but I'm not consenting anymore, right? Because if I don't consent, that means they have to meet me where I'm at. That means I start treating them more like we're equals, even though, like, I didn't consciously consent to being put on the pedestal, but I was still on said pedestal. And once you realize where somebody's perception is and what they're perceiving of you, you also get to consent to, do I want to be this version of myself with this person? I think that's where we really realize that we have masks on in every relationship, and it's a co-creative energy that you can't tell me that you're the exact same person for every single person in your life, because it takes, if you're looking at human design, right, and you put two charts together, they commingle and become their own identity. And so that's the fact of the matter is, like, can you heal so deeply that no matter what relationship you are, you notice the pattern and you consent or you don't? Because that's true spiritual sovereignty, is the ability to step into your power fully and be the version of you that is unmasked. And when you are met with somebody that is asking you to put a mask on that you don't want to consent to, and you can notice the pattern instead of reacting to the pattern, or just like It could be like, it could be fight or flight, right? You could be reacting, so that's fight. You could be running away from somebody, or maybe even like the fawn. Maybe you just like collapse into the pattern. You just are exhausted and you're like, okay, fine, this is what you expect of me. This is what I am. Can you recognize the pattern that you're living in? And can you step into your sovereignty and say, no, I energetically don't consent to this, and continue? And this is how we like alter timelines from a quantum physics standpoint, is that we realize the patterns that we're in relationships. We no longer consent to them. We start continuing to act as the person that is sovereign, whatever that looks like to you. The person that stands up for who she is, he is, probably she, because this podcast is called From Within She Rises, but I could be wrong. If men want to listen to me talk all day about things, I welcome that as well. Anyways, so from that place that you're acting from your future self, from that place that knows divinely and sovereignly who they are, these boundaries become effortless, right? Because you are aware of the patterns you are aware, like when in the trigger, what they're trying to project onto you. And your boundary goes up and you say, I'm not that, so I'm going to keep acting from the woman that I am now. And your presence becomes calm. And that's where we want to be acting from. We want to be acting from that fire integrated place. We want to be acting from the calm presence. We want to be acting from joy, because joy then becomes your honesty. And this is what Hathor on the other side of truth, which is what Sekhmet becomes when she's no longer needed. She does her thing. She walks away. She becomes the other side of truth. And it's not naive joy. It's earned joy. It's joy that no longer needs to pretend. It's the joy that realizes I truly am the creator of my own reality, and I can be exactly who I'm meant to be in any interaction, and I have full sovereignty over that. I get to choose. And what a joyful place to live when you realize that you are actually the author, the creator of your entire reality and your relationships as well. You can't force somebody to be exactly what they want, but you can choose to be who you are in that, and not be who they think that you should be. And you can also choose to see them in their best light and treat them that way, because they will start to become that person. We really underestimate the ability to co-create with each other. We truly do. So that is Sekhmet. And that is an energy that you can bring I would say for me, Sekhmet is the energy in those co-creative spaces, in the trigger moment with and maybe it doesn't start with the comments. Maybe it does start with the comments, because sometimes it's easier to step into that power when you don't actually know the person. So now every time I get trigger, I'm like, oh, I'm seeing it from this perception. Why is this triggering me? Because maybe, and then I can take a step back and I'm like, oh, but I can see it if it meant this instead. And what if I just don't respond? And so I can heal the little part of me that was triggered, and I can also meet them without them, just energetically meet them on the positive side of things. Like, they may have meant this. I can meet them there energetically and shift our co-creative relationship. But also, again, that's the energy of the truth, the pattern. Walk away, you become joy. You get to choose. You get to co-create from a different perspective. And you can take that into every relationship, every co-creative situation in your life. So yeah, Sekhmet isn't here to help you fight the world, but she is here to help you stop arguing with it, which is probably the hardest thing to do. I feel like fighting the world is easier. She arrives when truth no longer needs your voice raised, only your consent to withdraw. If this episode resonated, then trust that. You don't need to explain it. You don't need to argue. You don't need a formal agreement. Just stay with what you know. Thank you for listening. I love you. And as always, I will see you in the next spiral.